my great pleasure now to invite up to the lectern the first of our speakers, our keynote speaker, Bradley Foxlewin.
I've named this talk, You Can't Keep a Good Man Down, and that's around my mental health history and the challenges that I've faced across my lifetime since being a teenager. I just want to say about that, when I thought about the title, it sounds like a bit of an individualistic project, the idea of you can't keep one good man down, and that it was all about me mining my interiority for resilience and goodness, and that's what actually made the difference. I just want to unpack that and demystify that, as that's not what occurred. It actually much more about relationships and engaging with others and seeking the right supports and getting into the right places and being positioned well for wellness. Yeah, so I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. So no one's walking around with the wrong idea that it's me about a hero's journey, drawing out my sword, cutting through mental illness and all that business. It's not the way it worked out. So that's me when I was a little fella, about 18 months old there. And I just wanted to put that up there, kind of like, everybody, most people get a reasonable start. And I want to talk about how that actually supports people in their wellness, is to get a reasonable start, and how we need to be focusing on the early years of people's lives in order that people do get a good start, parents, children, families and community, and how that can be enabled. And also to state that sometimes along the way other things occur, and some people are grown up in ways that don't actually support their mental health. And I speak with many people about trauma histories and how those trauma histories underpin their mental health challenges. And I identify in that space that I'm one of those folks. And it's important to make sense of trauma and how it underpins mental health if we're actually going to move forward and re-establish those relationships. So as much as I say early intervention and prevention, I'm also not advocating for abandoning those people who haven't had those systems and supports in place to actually be able to move forward in their adult lives. Because we're actually working with the ages of people. More often than not, I can be 53, which is my current chronological age. I can also be 14, I can also be 3, and all of those things in my approaches to the world, if I haven't had the opportunities to develop those skills. So it's a powerful image, isn't it, this particular one. Most of the images in this presentation are drawn from a photo exhibition that was done by an organisation that I worked for as a coordinator, the Young Men's Support Network, and it was around a mentoring project that we initiated, 28 men working with 40 young men who didn't have appropriate role models and didn't have the wherewithal to be able to move forward. And we did a whole series of photo exhibition development and framing these things and putting them on in Garema Place to actually advertise the importance of mentoring and relationships in people's recovery. So I want to talk a little bit about my early days in communities and psychological recovery. And I name psychological recovery right here because I don't think it's actually the be and end all of recovery. I actually think that it's a part thereof of recovery, and social and relational recovery is just as important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So my early kind of entry into the workforce after a significant mental illness was to join up with Men Against Sexual Assault. So that tells a little bit about my history. I'm not going to go into terrible stories of trauma because that wouldn't be appropriate here, but it is to recognise that people move through trauma and find their ways, and often people come into their mental health challenges through no fault of their own. It's actually at the hands of other people, and we know that statistically that 90% of the people who come into our services, their mental health challenges are underpinned by trauma. So I think it has to be taken into account. I joined the Young Men's Support Network. It was a 10-hour-a-week youth worker position, and I ran a young fathers group, 6 young fathers under the ages of 18 with young children. And I must have been doing something right because after I think about 4 weeks of that project, 4 of those young men disclosed 3 disclosed significant sexual abuse, and 1 disclosed significant neglect in his childhood. And those things were underpinning the struggles they were having in parenting and all of those sorts of things. It was in those days when you only had to be male and willing and say, I want to work with people, and you were thrown at everything. And so I was, some of you remember those times, and early 90s when supervision was just absolutely not even thought of as part of the equation, and you were just chucked in. And I'm a pretty good swimmer, so swimming away, but too many clients, too little supervision. Also having a history of kind of mental health challenges, that put me in a certain position to either sink or swim. And I swam for a long time, and got a lot of benefits out of actually engaging with that work and mining my interiority is what I call it. Is actually psychological recovery, mining my interiority for the goodies that I could bring, the wealth of knowledge I was studying at the time, and bringing all of that stuff forward. But I was missing an element, and I want to talk about that a little bit more later. So I invited relationships from the wider community. I actually developed the mentoring program from a 10-hour-a-week youth worker position to a service delivery project that had a coordinator manager, myself, a full-time counsellor, admin support, and 28 volunteer men working in that project. And it still carries on in Canberra, and it's now called MensLink, the MensLink project, and something that I'm really, really proud of. But part of it was about surrounding myself with people. In order that I didn't get into an isolated situation, and I found lots of mentors. I was adopted by one of those mentors, older man named Lev Vygotsky, who's a French Canadian man, and he said, he fairly cluey guy, watching out for what's going on, and high school principal. And he said to me, Bradley, you're doing all this stuff for these young men and these men coming into these programs. Who's actually mentoring you? Who's looking out for you? And he said, I want to be your honorary dad. And he did exactly that. He stayed by me, and he only just passed away last year. So I had a 15-year history of having an honorary dad, a family of choice that actually supported my mental wellness, even though I got significantly mentally ill again during that period. But he actually provided that underpinning support and attachment, is an earned attachment, that is how I would describe it, where there was little attachment before and little capacity to actually relate to others. Beyond the what you might call superficial role description, coordinator, lecturer, coordinator of a program, manager, all of those things. Pretty good at doing role description, but actually meeting people in a human kind of a way was challenging. So I was gathering evidence as well as doing some fantastic work and making a difference in many men's and young men's lives. So building a family of choice. That's what I created, and that's where I was situated. So these are important things for recovery from my perspective. And gaining professional qualifications. I knew I was doing a pretty good job, but I didn't really know how I was doing a pretty good job. So I went back and did study. I had lifeline telephone counselling training. I'm not kind of like dissing lifeline telephone counselling training in any way, but it doesn't necessarily support you to be a sexual assault counsellor, which is what I became. So I had to go and get further qualifications and actually support that project to move forward, both the personal project and the organisational project. Along the way, I moved out of the city. There was a critical incident in my workplace where a young man reported that something untoward had happened. There was no basis in it in the report. But he reported it, and the whole insurance thing came crashing down over the organisation, and we were shut down. We were shut down and squashed, and there was no conversation and no kind of way to defend our work practices and what we were doing and how we were doing it, because it was kind of like, when things happen, and it's almost like the ballast gets thrown off the side of the ship, and and the ship puts up all sails and tries to steam ahead of the storm, and it's driven by insurance companies rather than by something that's actually true to recovery practice and those sorts of things. I'm not saying that it was a bad thing, but how it affected the program and how it affected me was that it mirrored previous traumas. The betrayal mirrored previous traumas. In the program, I was being pushed up to a leadership position, a kind of like a traditional leadership position. It was a men's project, and many men kind of understand the idea of leadership as being the triangular top-down model. Yep. And what was happening is I was being pushed to the top, to the peak of that, and out of that came isolation. Yep. So in the space of betrayal, isolation, sense of loss of belonging and little sense of place, that's where I began to struggle again with my mental health challenges. I had shoulder reconstruction surgery, and this is a really important point, I think, for GPs and other professionals in physical health, is that physical health challenges link directly to mental health challenges. When bodies struggle, if you have a previous mental health history, your mental health struggles along the same time, because it's about vulnerability. And if you're already isolated and feeling a loss of agency and inability to work, I couldn't drive, I couldn't write, it was my right hand, I couldn't write, I couldn't even key in, I'm kind of locked up like this, on came the mental health overwhelm, basically, yeah, in that context. And alongside of that, I was working in a leadership program at a high school. Doesn't really matter what high school, but 2 young women disclosed sexual abuse to me, and I had to manage that process with the support of Rape Crisis, Domestic Violence Crisis Service and FACS over a period of 2 weeks to support those young women to get to a point where they could disclose safely. By that time I was burning muscle rather than fat, if you kind of get that metaphor, well and truly, and so I was absolutely overwhelmed by my previous mental health experience at that time, and had a period from there of about 4 years where I didn't write another invoice because the right sort of supports weren't in place until I actually started to find those supports again. So overwhelm and isolation. So just a couple of messages. Betrayals of trust are triggering. Yep. And for many trauma survivors, betrayals of trust are triggering, and they can come from anywhere and everywhere. And in this situation, largely they came through the workplace. And I think it tells us something about how we shape our workplace environments in order to support trauma-informed and recovery practice. And I had the privilege of actually talking to lawyers at their conference earlier in the year. And can you imagine lawyers talking trauma-informed practice? It kind of seemed a bit weird to me too, but what I took away from it and what I felt really supported by was that lawyers were talking about universal design and how do we shape our workplaces in order that people, lawyers with mental health challenges, can actually retain their kind of position and stay in the workforce and move forward and work out how does that work so that we can retain people and support a link to workplace and not lose those relationships, because isolation is the real downside of when people get mental health challenges through stigma. And my take is there's only one issue, and that's belonging. Yep, and community or communities is the key to actually supporting people to feel like they have a belonging and a sense of place and all of that stuff that underpins mental health. Then their psychological recovery can actually be enabled. But to my mind, the horse that goes before the cart of psychological recovery is social and relational, the social and relational domain that supports psychological recovery. Okay, I've got so many things here. I wonder which one to pick up. Okay, so this is when I was significantly unwell. This is how I described my mental health at the time, and I described it as a snakes and ladders board. That was the canvas upon which I was living my life, and what I knew at that point was that I'd been squashed to the point by betrayal and the mental illness itself that I didn't know how to climb ladders anymore. Yeah, I just didn't know how to climb ladders, and my previous experience of climbing ladders as a human rather than a role had been limited through trauma and the effects of trauma. So I didn't have a lot of evidence on how to climb ladders. So I had to focus on snakes. And what I mean by that is that, and many people I've talked to also speak about this snake knowledge, and it's what's the agency in how you cope? Yeah, how do you grab hold of the agency around how people cope? And it may be through drug and alcohol abuse. It may be through kind of like being a sex addict. It may be through smoking bongs for breakfast. It may be through a whole range of different things, ways people cope to stay on the planet long enough to get to a supportive person who can unpack that with them and find out how is it that you've survived, how is it that you've stayed alive long enough to come and meet with me and move forward. So, and that's what occurred when, that's what actually occurred. So I had evidence of it, but it was at a distance because I was quite isolated, yeah? But I had to do something about it because I was just being a pain in the ass basically to my family. I was kind of like inside for 2 months on the lounge, and my partner would say, "Your horse is just walking past the window." And I'd had dissociative episodes and all sorts of stuff going on around that. And she would say, "Every day, your horse is just walking past the window," because there was nothing she felt like she could do. And I absolutely agree with the speaker who spoke earlier about carers or mothers being the case manager. Yeah, I think that's really important thing to state, because many people I speak to, they want their mothers back, they want their brothers back, they want their sons and daughters back from the caring role. Yeah, they want their mum, they want their dad, they want their brothers and sisters. Yeah, so we need to find another way of actually supporting people to engage in those relationships without shaping carers as part of the treatment team. Because that has its own problematic. Yeah? So we need to really have a mature conversation about what that looks like. So in examining my snake knowledge of previous history, and drug and alcohol abuse was one of those to manage the kind of trauma symptoms, and I went back into that through that period, and to find out that that's what was actually keeping me alive. And that was what was enabling me to, but I knew it had reached its use-by date. I knew it, and so I went to visit a GP, and or I was kind of like coerced to visit the GP, kind of leave it out to go and visit the GP. And one of the things that stands out as really memorable to me was on the first conversation, he was quite brief and quite straight with me, and this is what I think you need to do. And in the second conversation, he left about 8 people waiting in the waiting room and spent an hour with me to work through what I needed to say and how could I move forward. And he actually unpacked that and took that hour, and I was so amazed to come out into the waiting room and see people waiting. And it was like, this one person is willing to spend time with me and hold back others in order to have my story and my recovery be of importance. It was a massive achievement. All I needed from him after that was the 15-minute opportunity, and sometimes I asked for an extended, what do you call that? Extended appointment. Yeah? Double appointment. But that was hugely meaningful in that first part. And that was a turning point for me. It was actually a turning point where I actually started to, I took up medication at that time in order to manage the challenges and the overwhelm. And for a period of time until I was able to find social and relational kind of supports that actually allowed me to bring that medication down to nothing and move forward in an unmedicated way. Yeah. So, but he talked to me about my snake knowledge. He wanted to know about how I'd survived, how I'd made it this far, what I'd done, without laying judgment on any of those things. And it was powerful. It was palpably powerful. So, and then, okay, so now we're moving into the domain of social and relational recovery. But just before I go on, I wonder, what do you think about that? What do you think about a doctor who might spend that hour and kind of keep other patients waiting, and how meaningful that was to me? Has anyone got examples of how that works?
The reality is that for each person that comes in, they're not just a mental health issue. They're medical issues. There are a whole lot of issues that we've got to deal with. And, you know, that G in general practice is not G for God, because we're actually supposed to look at all the bits and pieces that come through, have a handle on it all, and process it. So it just means clear thinking, having a line of thinking as to each one of the things that you deal with, where they all interact with each other, and remember that I am not necessarily the best person to be the holistic manager of one condition, but to recognise for each of the conditions that you deal with that you are part of a team. So,
just very quick answer, like one word answer almost. Is it fundamentally more time efficient to give a decent lump with a troubled patient so you can be briefer later?
absolutely.
From there, I want to move into this place called learning community and learning recovery, because I actually believe very strongly in that idea of learning recovery alongside the idea of psychological recovery. Both of those things have a place. So my experience with that was doing a master's degree in applied science, social ecology and organisational development. It was actually putting myself into an environment that was understanding of ecology, understanding of psychology, understanding of environmental studies, understanding of community and how groups work and how people work within those. It was a really telling environment for me to figure out, where am I positioned in this world? What does it look like? What do I know about myself? And what do I know about how the world works and how that shapes me and how I shape the world? It was a really, really good place for me to position myself to learn about how groups work and how I work within them. Because I had very little evidence prior to that. I only had negative experiences to draw on. So I needed to find a place where I could gain those positive experiences and actually embody those. Yeah? So I became a learner and a writer, a shocking writer. You should have seen my first assignments. It was kind of like my partner. So I said, take the red pen. God. But, over time, I considered myself a knowledge holder, and I had supportive relationships with staff and students and through an ecological approach. Yeah, so I absolutely support that. But I wasn't yet convinced. I still didn't have the weight on the positive side and wasn't able to kind of like overlay those positives to outweigh the negatives that often kept rushing up and kind of overwhelming me and taking me into mental health challenge. So more snakes and ladders. So I went back to more snakes and ladders, and what was a key player in this was I sought to do a PhD, and I asked one of the gurus in qualitative research design from the States I wanted to check out with her. I want to do a PhD around men's capacities and their adventitiously acquired knowledge, which means knowledge from the margins, who'd been sexually abused. I wanted to find out how those men had learned to be in the world and put that forward in a PhD. And this lovely lady, with all the best of intents, said, "Don't you think somebody else should do that research?" Because I'd identified to her that I had mental health challenges. So she said, "Wouldn't it be better if somebody else did that research?" I was shattered. I was absolutely shattered. And it took me back into snakes and ladder land for a period of time. But I persisted with the help of others. So it doesn't just come in episodes. It comes in kind of like waves, and things are bigger and sometimes they're smaller. And to my mind, it's dependent on the supports that you have that makes it kind of doable or bearable or workable. So I became kind of like a trauma survivor again and a prey animal. I actually felt like my gaze narrowed. I was only ever looking for threat from the university in that space, and I was overwhelmed by that. And eventually I collected some really rich data, which still sits on my shelf at home, and got ethics approval, the whole bit. It was quite a challenge to do that in a university setting with a vulnerable group. I was in a place of just watching. Where's the threat coming from? And that's a survivor response. And it didn't support me to have my academic head on. So I put it aside for that period of time. It's coming though. I think 2017, I can do that. Yeah. But, and then I've discovered Lev Vygotsky. Have people heard of Lev Vygotsky? Yeah, and every function, and I think this is true for adults as well, every function in a child's development appears twice. First on the social level and later on the individual level. First between people, into psychological, and then on the inside of the child. And it comes back to, for me, that when we're working with people, we're working with the ages of people. When you're working with me, sometimes you're working with me as the child part. Yeah? And so this stuff still holds true. It's what occurs in the relationship between you and me, and the identity kind of like construction ideas that can happen in that space that then I can take on as mine and embody those things. It's quite a different concept to the idea that we develop our identity from the inside out. And from a mental health perspective, I think this has the future in it. Yeah? So I was offered this slide by a lovely colleague, and I just think it's wonderful. It does freak me out. It does freak me out too, you know. Sometimes I'm ongoingly challenged by my mental health, by my mental health. I had a dissociate episode for about 4 hours about 2 months ago when I was really, really heightened around collecting a research award, would you believe? I had 2 significant panic attacks last year that kind of kept me out of the small cubicle toilet option for about a month, and kind of kept me out of small spaces and kept people a little bit distanced while I kind of found my way through that. But I am unsupervised, you know, and I don't see my doctor or any other health professional as you know, a godlike figure, as you were saying. I see them as part of the pit crew. They're part of my pit crew. I'm the central figure. It's my job to supervise myself and get those supports when I need them. Yeah? But it's a bit freaky. It's a bit freaky sometimes. So what I understand communities to be as landscapes of action and identity. You know, we need to be able to take action in our own lives, to be influential in our own lives, in our families, in our work environments, in our social domain, spaces to participate: work, family, sport, learning, education, art, poetry, comedy, theatre, and performances of self. Is what I call it, is performances of self. If you haven't got that kind of identity category, you can perform it and find it with the support of others and a supportive environment. Taking up roles and positions. Sometimes role-playing a thing is kind of like fake it till you make it, until you get the evidence to say, yeah, that's mine. I can own that. But sometimes it's faking it in the first place to position yourself long enough with those supports around. And I gather my supports. You know, I've got supportive people in the room today who are kind of like, you know, routing for me for being in the front of the room. And I've had emails and texts over the last couple of weeks to support this actually occurring. You know, it's real and tangible for me. So finding peer relationships, shared interests, and broadening the definition of peer. Like, you know, in the peer workforce kind of like idea in mental health, we have the idea that we're going to bring forward people with lived experience to support others with lived experience. And it's a fantastic idea and needs to occur because of the relational and social domain within people's lives to unpack isolation and actually support people to come in. And but we need to broaden that because a whole bunch of my peer relationships are student relationships, and they're academic research relationships, where I can actually identify as who I am, which is and I claim that a survivor consumer status, and that's my first position. That's the place that supports me to do the most good, because it saves me a whole bunch of effort in trying to pass as a normal human being. Yeah? I'm over that. You know, I'm completely over that. It doesn't serve me. It didn't serve me back then. Although I say to people who have a mental health history who aren't out, to steal a GLBTI metaphor, who aren't out, to actually take care to actually take care in coming out, because there is stigma, there is discrimination. To go easy with that and take your time and find your way through. But for me, the weight of living the lie is far more damaging to my mental illness than actually coming out and being who I am and living that life. Yeah. So broadening, academic peers, student peers, peers in mental health recovery, all of those domains, and because it supports family of choice. And it actually enables people to make relationships where I can say, this person argues strongly for me while I argue strongly for myself. Yeah? So actions that cement identity. Yeah? So you take an action, it kind of like gives evidence, and then you can claim it on the landscape of identity that says, this is who I am. And if you want to know more about that, draw on narrative practice. Talks clearly about landscapes of action and identity and how those things work. Okay, so there's another little slide. This is again from that photo exhibition, but you've got two guys here who might not necessarily hang out together generally, but these are two of the mentors in the Young Men's Support Network mentoring project who are kind of learning how to be in relationship with each other, and with all of the signs, stop, give way, go left, other ranks car park is the one that I really like. Yeah, because it tells a whole other story, doesn't it? Yeah. So the Mental Health Consumer Network, so identifying as a consumer, so I joined the Mental Health Consumer Network after that significant period of mental ill health, and to find peers, to find somebody else who got it, because I was so much living in small town New South Wales was quite difficult to find others who got it without kind of like turning their head or glazing over or looking the other way or actually crossing the street. Yeah, that stuff, which is operations of stigma are really powerful. So recovering peer relationships, doing the seclusion and restraint project at the Canberra Hospital and achieving significant reductions in seclusion, like went from around 13% of admissions to less than 1% over a period of 2 years. Unheard of in Australia, but was actually, thank you. And what allowed that to occur was bringing the consumer voice to the centre. What experience of exclusion and lack of inclusion and how you're treated and how you're talked to and psychological coercion and all of those things that sit just back here from seclusion and physical restraint and chemical restraint, all the other stuff, actually unpacking that on a week-by-week basis changed the culture so that people understood why they would do other practices besides secluding people. Yeah? And this is the domain that we're talking within, even in this situation, is how do we do psychological coercion? How do we push people and not situate them in their own recovery? Yeah, how do we become the expert in people's lives when people need to be the expert in their own? Yeah? So research and recovering an academic identity. So after I shelved my PhD, I thought, I'm never going to research again, this is too hard. How can I possibly manage that? But I did a research project that has now won a national award for the project, for the report on seclusion reduction at a national level just that couple of months ago, which, although it prompted a dissociative event, it was still really powerful. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. You got to run with it, go with the flow. So there's been awards and rewards, but they're actually artefacts that actually sit beside the landscape of identity. There's an action, research artefact. You do that thing, and then the award comes, and it actually helps cement that identity category for a person, and that's almost universal from the people that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to thousands. Across the years in community services as well. So communities as spaces to tell. Trust, reliability, confidence and confidentiality are critically important to be able to suspend judgment and blame. The things that have taken me down quickest is when there's shame, blame, and isolating kind of comments. They're the things that take me down quickest. Yep. And and to suspend judgment and blame on drug and alcohol, to suspend judgment and blame on coping strategies that might not look like nice and good coping strategies to us. To actually horizontalise those things and say, this is how a person is managing their life right now, and I want to hear about the agency that underpins them managing their life. That's what I want to hear about, because therein lies the motivation for people to take up other coping strategies. If I get rid of all that and say, no, that's wrong, you should not be doing all that stuff, then what I push away is a big chunk of their agency and their snake knowledge. I actually made a conscious choice after the PhD thing to not engage in communities that dealt in shame, blaming and shaming. I made that decision for myself because I knew that that was really bad for my mental health. If I engage in those processes, I will struggle. I know that. So I made that as a conscious choice. But it took a while. Okay, so along the way, 2 stories are told. You know, as I'm kind of like managing my mental illness, and there's almost like a fight. There's a fight between 2 parts of myself that says, okay, you need to be an individual, take on the cloak of manhood, tough it out, be strong, mine your interiority for your well-being and all of that kind of stuff. Or the other choice is actually engage with people and spend time and get over the resistance to key in the numbers, to talk to people and actually go into the social and relational domain where the healing is and where the learning is, for that matter. Yeah, chose to take a consumer first position. Got some paid work as a consumer identifying trainer after that period with the Mental Health Coordinating Council, Adult Survivors of Child Abuse, and the Mental Health Commission. They are all environments that at least seek to limit shame, and all organisations have got some ways to go yet around that. Yeah, we're talking about it all the time in the Mental Health Commission, about how do we reduce shame and blame, how do we be inclusive, how do we inadvertently shut people out, how do we include, because that's the important stuff. And through that, because I took up the consumer first position as a choice, because I started when I did my PhD, I took up a survivor first position, but it wasn't tenable. It wasn't tenable at the time. So I moved across, I took up a consumer first position because that was more available to people's ears, through the mental health system. But through situating myself in non-blame environments, I've actually been able to take up a survivor consumer first position. So it's kind of like back, forward, and with care this time, rather than last time was not as careful. Yeah. So there's another image. It's quite telling, isn't it? People coming into their humanity. And just a quote that I really love from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross when she was asked, yeah?
I have to ask you to clap that quote. So what do you say to someone who says, listen, mate, professional boundaries are essential. They're essential for the protection of the patient and for my emotional survival as a professional. What would you say?
Well, I would say that it's actually not including the person from a human perspective, and there is room for professional boundaries. But we need to have a far more mature conversation if we understand trauma-informed care and practice and what people's actual needs are. We have to mature our conversation around the flexibility of those boundaries and to support meeting people in their individual needs, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all, I must stay aloof from this person, because that aloof kind of presentation actually mirrors a whole bunch of people's lived experience of trauma. So it mirrors that, and if we take that aloof approach, what we do is it provides the capacity to re-traumatise people. They shut down or they arc up, and we're not getting anywhere. So we need to have a far more mature conversation around boundary sets. Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, and I know, and it's because I know that, and it's. I think, Elizabeth, this quote is fantastic. I just wanted to show you my support team, and there are many others. This is my partner and my daughter in Gujarat in India about 18 months ago, being quite kind of culturally sound and dealing with the weather. And there are many others, and there are people in this audience who have been and continue to be really supportive of me. Finding environmental relationships that actually support me, finding animal relationships that actually support me. My little mental health dog there, yeah, his name's Toby, and I have 4 horses, and I'm training in equine-assisted psychotherapy. So, yeah, cool, we'll talk. So, you know, it's actually positioning in the world. It's positioning in relationship. It's positioning in relation to the land that I live on. It's positioning in all of my relational and what I hold dear out there in the world that makes the biggest differences for me. So building a house is part of that. You know, having a castle, that sort of idea, and that's a mud brick house. So it's all lots of sweat and tears. A little bit of blood too in there. Yeah. And that's me, a photo from a couple of years ago, and going back to the little guy. So there's that, and there's that, and there's that, and there's that. So thank you.